The neon vacancy sign blinked against the humid Texas night, buzzing faintly like an insect trapped in glass. Beyond it stretched the kind of roadside motel built in the 70s, square in shape, its paint dulled to the color of cigarette smoke, its doors lined up like teeth. A single ceiling fan turned lazily in the office window, but behind the glass no clerk appeared. The date was June 12th, 1999, and inside room 17, the Holloway family checked in for what should have been a quiet overnight stay on their way south. Mark and Linda Holloway were traveling with their two children, 12-year-old Sarah and 8-year-old Jacob. They carried with them the banal clutter of travel suitcases half-zipped, children's clothes folded without care, and a cooler sweating ice water in the corner. By morning, they would be gone. Not just missing from their room, not just absent from the parking lot, but erased, as if they had slipped through a seam no one else could see. 24 years later, the case would crack open in a way no one expected, not with new testimony or a confession, but with a rusted SUV pulled from a dry creek bed, its doors closed, its seats empty, its upholstery holding the faint perfume of old fabric softener, and something darker. Inside were clothes, folded, preserved, set out almost neatly as though the Holloways had only stepped away for a moment. But the family themselves were never seen again. What happened in that motel room? Who sealed their fate? And why did their car resurface only decades later? Tonight, we unspool the trail of absence that began under the humming neon light of a roadside inn and ended with a discovery too strange to quiet. The first thing investigators noted when they entered room 17 was that nothing looked forced. The lock had not been broken, the chain not ripped away. Beds were turned down, pillows indented, but there was no luggage, no toothbrushes at the sink, no half-empty bottles of soda or snack wrappers left on the nightstand. Only the receipt in the motel ledger told them the Holloways had stayed. That receipt, time-stamped 9:42 p.m., bore the initials of the night clerk. She remembered them faintly. A man, a woman, and two children, tired faces, polite smiles, and a short exchange about the ice machine. Then nothing. When pressed, she admitted she never saw them leave. At dawn, the room was empty, and their car was gone from the lot. For the local sheriff's office, the disappearance was an irritant more than an emergency. Adults sometimes left without notice. Families argued. Cars broke down, and people caught rides elsewhere. But within days, relatives began to call. No one had heard from them. Mark had a job waiting, Linda had appointments booked, Sarah's summer camp registration was due, and Jacob's baseball coach was expecting him at practice. Yet phones rang to voicemail, and mail piled up at their house across the state. The sheriff finally entered them as missing. What followed was a scattershot investigation. Deputies combed nearby roads. A helicopter circled the scrublands. Truckers were questioned at the diner across the highway, but no trace appeared. It was as if the motel had swallowed the Holloways whole. The file thickened with notes, but thinned with leads. Witnesses contradicted each other. A waitress swore she saw the children in her restaurant 2 towns over the next morning. A gas station attendant thought he recognized Mark filling up a dark sedan a week later. None of it held. Months turned to years. The motel changed owners. Room 17 was repainted, and its carpet was replaced. The memory of the family faded into local lore. Some whispered they had staged their disappearance. Others believed the desert itself had claimed them. But the file remained open, a manila folder tucked into a drawer marked unresolved. It would stay there until the summer of 2023, when a drought gripped the county. Reservoirs shrank, creeks dried to cracked clay beds, and in one forgotten gully, a boy scavenging for scrap metal saw the glint of chrome. What he found was an SUV buried beneath brush and time. Its license plates matched the Holloway family's vehicle. When deputies hauled it free with winches and chains, its body was scarred but intact. Inside were the clothes, folded children's shirts. Jeans neatly stacked. A single shoe. Laces tucked inside. But no bones. No blood. No bodies. The discovery reopened everything. Reporters crowded the sheriff's lobby. Relatives resurfaced, gray-haired now, demanding answers. And a new generation of detectives found themselves staring at artifacts from a crime older than some of them were alive. One of those detectives was Elena Marquez, a quiet investigator known for her methodical attention to detail. She was the one who opened the boxes stored for 2 decades in the evidence room, each one labeled with fading ink. Inside, she found the original Motel ledger, its corners curled. Photographs of room 17, black and white, blurred from old cameras. Interview transcripts typed on paper, so thin the words had ghosted through to the reverse side. She read them all, marking contradictions, circling names and building timelines. And then she drove out to the motel itself. The neon sign still buzzed. The paint was newer, the office was remodeled, but the structure remained. She walked the row of doors until she reached 17. The air smelled of dust and asphalt. She stood there a long time, imagining the sound of a key turning and the weight of a suitcase thudding onto the bedspread. She pressed her palm to the cool metal of the door and whispered to herself, they were here, and then they weren't. That was where the new search began. It would lead her into archives, across desolate landscapes, and into the memories of those who had tried to forget. It would reveal a pattern of disappearances wider than anyone guessed. And it would expose what the SUV really was. Not an end, but a message. Detective Elena Marquez sat in the evidence room long after the others had left, the whir of the overhead fan rattling like an unsteady clock. Before her were objects frozen in amber, fragments of a life interrupted. The Holloway case file had been dormant for nearly a quarter century, yet here she was, reawakening ghosts that had been boxed away and mislabeled as forgotten. She began by reconstructing the night of June 12th, 1999, step by step, as though time itself might be persuaded to run backward, if observed closely enough. Mark Holloway had been driving south on Interstate 35, Linda beside him, the children in the back seat fighting sleep. They pulled off near the small town of Del Rio, lured by the glow of a roadside motel that promised cool air and clean sheets. At the front desk, the clerk slid them the key to room 17. From that point onward, everything became speculation. No one saw them leave. No neighbor heard a struggle. And yet the Holloways ceased to exist beyond that door. Elena studied the photographs of the room from that night. The images were grainy, lit by a deputy's flashlight, but the details spoke. A cup of melted ice water on the counter. The edge of a Gideon Bible sticking out from a drawer. A comforter wrinkled in the outline of a body that had never risen from it. These were not dramatic signs of violence, but subtle traces of absence. She found herself leaning close, searching for patterns where none had been recorded. Then she opened a smaller envelope, its paper brittle, the flap yellowed with age. Inside were Polaroids taken of the motel parking lot. There, under the buzzing fluorescent light, was an empty rectangle of oil-stained pavement where the Holloways SUV had been. That was the first confirmed detail. The vehicle had left the premises, though no witness could say when. The discovery of that same SUV decades later was not closure, but provocation. Whoever had left it folded with children's clothes inside had done so deliberately. Elena turned her attention to the transcripts. The motel clerk described Mark as quiet, polite, and a little weary, and Linda as attentive to the kids, holding their hands. Sarah had clutched a stuffed rabbit, and Jacob a baseball cap too large for his head. The clerk said she checked them in quickly, wrote their names in the ledger, and handed over the key. When asked later if she saw anyone follow them, she shook her head. But one note in the transcript made Elena pause. The clerk had said, "I thought I saw the lights from their room flick off around 10, maybe a little after. I figured they went straight to bed." Elena underlined it. Lights off at 10. But the receipt was time-stamped 9:42 MN. That meant the entire family had gone from check-in to complete silence within 20 minutes. Too neat, too fast. She rose from the table and pinned copies of the photographs to the corkboard in her office. On the left, the motel room. In the center, the empty parking space. On the right, the rusted SUV was pulled from the creek bed. Between them stretched 24 years of void. She drew a thin red thread connecting the three. Now she needed to fill the space between. Over the following days, Elena canvassed the original investigators. Most of them retired, their memories blurred by time. Some recalled the motel as a nuisance case. Others admitted they assumed the Holloways had run off intentionally. But one deputy remembered something odd. A truck parked behind the motel that night, engine idling, its cab light flicking on and off. He had written it in his report, but it had never been followed up. Elena dug into the archives and found the note. White pickup, dent in fender, seen near backlot around 10:30 p.m. The plate number was never taken. She closed her eyes, picturing it. The Holloways asleep or preparing for bed. The children tucked in. The parents maybe whispering about the next day's drive. Outside, a truck was waiting in the shadows. Was it coincidence? Or was it the missing link? She drove to the motel again, walking the backlot where weeds now pushed through the asphalt. Standing there, she could see how someone could wait unnoticed. No cameras in 1999. No guardrails. No locked gates. A truck could idle there all night without drawing attention. And if the family had been lured or forced out of their room, this was the exit path no one had considered. Back in her car, Elena's phone buzzed. It was the forensics team analyzing the SUV. "We've pulled fibers from the back seat," the tech said. "Some are consistent with the Holloway's clothing, but there are others we can't match. Different texture, different origin." Elena gripped the wheel tighter. So someone else was in the car? That's what it looks like. That night, she spread her notes across her kitchen table. A pattern began to take shape. Faint but insistent. The Holloways did not vanish into thin air. They were moved. The SUV was not abandoned randomly. It was placed, and the clothes folded inside were not evidence of peace but of staging, a performance designed to mislead. She stared at the faded photograph of Sarah's stuffed rabbit, its ear bent, its fur matted. Objects told stories when people could not. This one whispered of a child wrenched from sleep, taken into the night, and never returned. Elena knew she was only at the beginning. But the more she read, the more one question pressed against her ribs like a blade. Who went to such lengths to erase an entire family? And why did their absence echo so loudly 2 decades later? The SUV sat beneath floodlights in the county impound lot, its red paint dulled to a matte bruise, chrome pitted by rust. Elena Marquez walked a slow circle around it, notebook in hand, treating the vehicle as though it were a witness that had finally broken its silence. She noted the unnatural details first. The windows were rolled up, all intact. The doors unlocked. The interior was too clean for a car that had supposedly sat in a creek bed for decades. No silt in the carpet, no insect nests in the vents, and no animal remains in the trunk. Instead, there were clothes folded neatly on the back seat, as though a mother had prepared them for the next day. Sarah's small t-shirt, Jacob's shorts, Mark's work shirt, and Linda's blouse. All pressed flat, stacked one atop the other. It was not preservation. It was an arrangement, and that chilled her more than any trace of decay. She opened the glove compartment and found nothing but an empty gum wrapper, crisp as if placed yesterday. In the console, no papers, no registration slips. Every trace of routine had been wiped. She crouched at the driver's side, tracing a finger over the floor mat where, years ago, an officer had noted the presence of unidentified debris. That detail was lost in time, never analyzed. Now the mat showed faint fibers pressed into its weave foreign, not belonging to the Holloways. Forensics would need to pull them carefully. But in her mind, the car was already testifying. Someone else had been here. At the station, she replayed the original witness interviews. One neighbor near the motel had described seeing a family walk out to a vehicle late that night, though he could not swear it was the Holloways. Another insisted they had heard a child cry, muffled, then a car door slam. But those accounts were dismissed, chalked up to unreliable memory. Elena wrote them fresh into her notes, underlining them twice. A muffled cry, a car door, details too sharp to ignore. She decided to meet with the motel clerk again, now 2 decades older, retired, her hair silver and tied back in a bun. They sat in her kitchen, the smell of coffee grounding the moment. The woman's eyes were wary, as though reopening old stories risked summoning them back. "Do you remember the Holloway family?" Elena asked softly. "I try not to," the clerk admitted. "But yes, I remember the girl's rabbit. She left it on the counter while her mother signed the ledger. I told her not to forget it." She smiled shyly and tucked it under her arm. "That's the last I saw of them." Elena slid a photograph of the SUV across the table. This was found in August, in a creek bed north of here. Their clothes were still inside, folded. The clerk's hand shook as she lifted the photo. "Folded?" she whispered. No, that doesn't make sense." "What doesn't?" "The father, Mark. He was polite, but he was tired. He set the key on the counter with a clatter, like a man too weary to fuss. That family wasn't neat. They weren't careless, but folded clothes? That wasn't them." The words echoed in Elena's mind. Not them. Staging. The SUV wasn't a grave. It was a display. Someone had taken the time to arrange artifacts of their lives in a way that would confuse, unsettle, and mislead. Later that evening, Elena drove to the creek bed where the SUV had been recovered. The earth was cracked, its surface veined like old skin. The recovery team had left deep tire ruts in the soil, now hardened by the Sunday. She crouched where the front bumper had protruded from the clay, imagining the moment it had been abandoned. The creek was remote, hidden from the highway by brush. Whoever left the SUV here had wanted it forgotten. But if that was true, why not torch it, strip it, and scatter it? Why fold the clothes? Why leave an intact message to be found only when drought revealed its bones? Her phone buzzed in her pocket. The forensics lab. "Detective, we pulled a partial fingerprint from the inside of the passenger side rear door. It's not a match for any of the Holloways." Elena straightened slowly, heart hammering. "Do we have a hit?" "Not in the state database. We'll send it through federal." She looked out across the barren creek bed, the sun sinking low, shadows pooling in the hollows of earth. The Holloways had vanished without sound, but now their absence spoke in the language of artifacts. Folded clothes, stray fibers, and a stranger's print. Back at her office, she added the print to the board, connecting it with red thread to the motel, the SUV, and the testimonies. Each line made the void smaller, more claustrophobic. Yet the center remained blank. Who had taken them? Who staged the vehicle? Why wait 24 years to let it surface? She found herself staring at the photograph of Jacob's baseball cap, one side stained darker than the other. The lab had said it was water damage, nothing more. But Elena wondered if water was only the beginning of what that hat had seen. By midnight, the office was empty, the halls silent. Elena sat with the board glowing in the lamplight, her eyes fixed on the threads. The Holloway family story was not one of disappearance, but of relocation, concealment, and performance. And the SUV was not an answer. It was a provocation. Whoever left it had chosen to speak again after silence. She closed her notebook, the words of the motel clerk still ringing in her ears. That wasn't them. She whispered the question aloud, letting it settle into the dark. If it wasn't them, then who was it? Detective Elena Marquez returned to the archive the next morning, with a new angle pressing against her mind. If the Holloway's SUV had been staged, perhaps they were not the only family to have been treated this way. She began pulling files not just from the Holloway case, but from other disappearances logged in the county during the 90s. Dust rose in the stale air as boxes were wheeled onto her desk, their corners frayed, their labels fading. She paged through them one by one, and slowly a theme emerged. There was the Ruiz family, last seen leaving a motel in Abilene in 1994. Their car was never found, but their room had been cleared of belongings as if they had simply checked out without paying. There was the case of a traveling salesman in 1996 whose car reappeared months later in an empty parking lot, its trunk packed with folded shirts he never owned. And then, in 1998, a young couple was en route to Houston, their belongings recovered in the back of an abandoned van, carefully arranged but scrubbed of fingerprints. Each of these cases shared the same paradox: sudden disappearance, vehicles abandoned in odd places, and objects folded or placed as if someone had taken the time to compose a scene. Elena pinned the details to her board, red threads branching outward like a web. The Holloways weren't an isolated tragedy. They were part of a pattern that stretched across years, maybe across the state. She needed to test her theory. That afternoon, she requested a meeting with Sergeant David Klein, one of the few officers still working who had been on duty in 1999. They sat in the station conference room, its blinds drawn against the heat. Klein was grizzled now, his hair white, his eyes lined with fatigue. "You're chasing ghosts, Marquez," he said, as she laid out her files. "Maybe," Elena replied evenly. "But look at this. 4 disappearances in 5 years. Families, travelers, couples. Every case has the same hallmarks: no forced entry, vehicles abandoned, and belongings folded or staged." Klein's brow furrowed as he flipped through the files. "We thought the Holloways ran off or got lost in Mexico. The others never saw the connection." "That's the problem," Elena said. "No one ever looked for the connection." Klein leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "If you're right, then whoever did this wasn't just lucky. They were careful, methodical, and they wanted people to look in the wrong direction. Or not look at all," Elena murmured. Later, Elena drove the lonely highway that cut past the old motel. The neon sign still flickered against the darkening sky, but the lot was nearly empty. She parked near the back, where the weeds grew tall, and sat watching as headlights flickered past on the distant road. The motel was not a sanctuary. It was a stage. A place where people stopped briefly, where strangers could watch unnoticed, and where departures could be rewritten. She imagined the Holloways walking out into the humid night, unaware they were stepping into a story already scripted by someone else. Back at the office, the forensics team called again. "We've run the partial fingerprint from the SUV through federal databases," the technician said. "It came back inconclusive. No direct match, but similar markers to prints from older cases in the 90s. "Possibly the same hand," Elena pressed. "Which cases?" The technician hesitated. "2 from out of state. One in Oklahoma, one in New Mexico. Both unsolved. Both involving missing travelers." The chill deepened in Elena's chest. This wasn't just Texas. Whoever was behind this had traveled, perhaps worked routes that carried them across state lines, leaving a trail of vanishings disguised as anomalies. The Holloways were one link in a chain far longer than anyone had realized. That night, Elena reviewed the tapes again. The grainy motel photos, the evidence photos of the SUV. Each time she paused, she felt as though she was being shown something just out of reach, a shadow at the edge of the frame. She thought again of the folded clothes, of the clerk's words. That wasn't them. The staging wasn't random. It was a signature, an author's flourish at the end of a sentence. Whoever arranged those artifacts believed that objects could tell a story more convincingly than people. The following morning, Elena visited the Holloway family's surviving relatives. Mark's brother met her on the porch of a weathered ranch house, his shoulders stooped, his eyes hollow from decades of unanswered questions. He invited her in, the smell of coffee heavy in the air. They were good people, he said quietly. Mark wouldn't run. Linda wouldn't leave her kids. We always knew something bad happened. We just never knew what. Elena showed him the photographs of the SUV. His jaw tightened as he studied the folded clothes. That's not right, he whispered. That's not how they traveled. Linda packed, but she didn't fold things like that. She'd toss clothes into bags and let the kids sort it later. This, he tapped the photo with a trembling finger. This is staged. Someone wanted you to see it that way. His words cemented Elena's fear. The Holloways had not left the motel of their own will. They had been moved, silenced, and arranged. And whoever did it had left behind a taunt, a story told through objects. Driving back to the station, Elena felt the weight of the pattern pressing down. If the Holloways were one chapter, there were others before and after, each with its own erased family, each staged like a play no one wanted to watch. And if the SUV had surfaced after 24 years, perhaps it was not an accident of drought, but a deliberate unveiling, as though the author of these disappearances had decided it was time to be remembered again. In her notebook, Elena wrote a single phrase in bold letters. The stage is speaking. The call came late on a Thursday evening. Elena was at her desk, the board glowing with photographs and red thread under a single lamp, when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was gravelly, old, and hesitant. "Detective Marquez?" "Yes," she replied cautiously. "You're digging into the Holloways. I saw something that night. I didn't tell the sheriff back then. Didn't want trouble. But it's been on me for years. Can we talk?" An hour later, Elena sat in the corner booth of a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where the neon beer signs never turned off, and the smell of fried onions seeped into the walls. Across from her sat an elderly man in a worn denim jacket. His name was Henry, a retired trucker who'd lived near the motel in 1999. His hands shook slightly as he wrapped them around a cup of coffee. "I was parked behind the place that night," Henry began. "Had a run the next morning. Figured I'd catch some sleep in my cab. Around midnight, I saw movement. A man leading a woman and 2 kids across the lot. The kids looked half asleep, stumbling. The man wasn't the father. Too tall, broader. He kept a hand on the boy's shoulder like he was guiding him. They got into a truck. White pickup, dented fender." Elena's pulse quickened. "Did you see the father? The mother?" Henry shook his head. "The woman, she was younger, maybe in her 20s. Dark hair. Didn't match the Holloway mother I saw in the papers later. And the man, he wasn't Mark Holloway. He was someone else entirely." The words dropped between them like stones. If Henry was telling the truth, then someone had staged not only the SUV, but also the Holloway's very departure from the motel. A decoy family moved under cover of night, while the real Holloways vanished another way. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Elena asked softly. Henry's eyes darted toward the window, where rain streaked down the glass. "Back then I figured it was just a family catching a ride. Didn't think much of it until I saw the news later. By then, the sheriff had already decided they'd run off. Didn't want to stir up trouble. But the image never left me. Those kids, they looked scared." Elena scribbled notes, her hand trembling slightly. A decoy. A planted performance. The signature of someone who wanted to confuse, to mislead, and to control the narrative. She thanked Henry, promised him confidentiality, and left the diner with her mind burning. Back at the station, she pulled the original transcripts again. No mention of Henry. No record of a truck parked behind the motel. The lead had been buried, either ignored or never reported. She stared at the photograph of the SUV again, the folded clothes lined up like actors in a tableau. Now, it seemed less like evidence and more like theater, crafted by someone who believed disappearance was an art form. The following morning, she drove the stretch of road between the motel and the creek bed, where the SUV had been found. Mile after mile of flat land, mesquite trees hunched against the horizon, abandoned barns sinking into the dirt. It was the kind of terrain where vehicles could vanish for decades, where silence swallowed everything. She pulled over near the old bridge where the SUV had been winched out. Standing there, she imagined a white pickup guiding the Holloways into the night, another vehicle trailing behind, carrying the evidence that would one day be staged for discovery. Her phone buzzed again. Forensics. Detective, we processed those fibers from the SUV's floor mats. They're nylon, dyed deep blue, consistent with uniforms, workwear, not casual clothing, possibly from coveralls or overalls. Uniforms. A worker. Someone who could move unnoticed in plain sight, blending into service stations, motels, and truck stops. Elena felt the ground shift under her feet. Whoever had taken the Holloways had not been a shadowy figure lurking in the dark. They had been visible, ordinary, and camouflaged in the fabric of everyday labor. That evening, she spread Henry's testimony across her board, pinning a photograph of a white pickup near the motel. She drew a line to the SUV, then another to the note about nylon fibers. A picture was forming, not of a ghost but of a method. A person who staged, who planted decoys, who arranged evidence like a playwright setting a stage. The Holloways had not simply disappeared. They had been curated, their absence sculpted into a story that misled investigators for decades. And now, 24 years later, the SUV's reemergence felt less like an accident of drought and more like a curtain call. As she sat in her office, rain tapping against the window, Elena whispered the question aloud, the one that had begun to haunt her every step. Who was the author of this play, and how many families had been written out of existence in the same hand? The file lay open on Elena's desk, the word nylon circled 3 times in her notes. Blue fibers, work uniforms. A detail so ordinary it might have been missed if the SUV hadn't resurfaced. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the evidence board. A motel in Texas, a creek bed, a staged tableau of folded clothes, and now a thread that led not to shadows, but to jobs. The next morning, she walked into the county records office, where old employment logs and contracts were stored in steel cabinets that smelled faintly of dust and mildew. She explained her request. Local businesses and service companies that had issued blue nylon coveralls or uniforms in 1999. The clerk raised an eyebrow but pointed her toward a row of drawers labeled licensing permits. Hours passed. Elena flipped through contracts for pest control companies, janitorial services, fuel distributors, and roadside mechanics. Then her fingers froze on a yellowing ledger. Red Star Maintenance Incorporated, a company that once serviced motels, gas stations, and rest stops across southern Texas, issued blue nylon coveralls to all staff, listed 27 employees in 1999. Half of them are itinerant hires with no fixed addresses. Elena copied the list, her pen scratching against the paper. One name stood out. An employee was terminated in late 1999 for failure to return company property, uniforms, vehicle, equipment. The note in the margin was sharp, written in a supervisor's hand. Unreachable. Last seen on the route near Willow Bend Motel. Her heart kicked. Willow Bend, the same motel where the Holloways had last been seen. That night, Elena spread the names across her board. Red Star Maintenance. Blue uniforms. One man gone, untraceable. The very month the Holloways disappeared. She pinned his name beside the SUV photo. The pattern was no longer speculation. It was converging. But the deeper she dug, the more the past resisted. When she tried to track Red Star's corporate filings, she found only fragments. The company had dissolved in 2001, its assets sold, its records scattered. A shell, discarded once its usefulness ended. She tracked down former employees, many of whom were reluctant to talk. Some claimed the company had been legitimate, a contractor for cleaning and repair work. Others hinted at side deals, cash jobs, off-the-books hauls, and supervisors who demanded silence. One man, a former mechanic, leaned in during their interview. "We all knew something was off," he muttered. They had routes that didn't make sense, jobs that didn't exist. Trucks came in with cargo no one checked. And always those uniforms' blue coveralls made you invisible. You could walk through a lobby, a diner, and a motel lot and nobody blinked. Just another worker. Invisible. The word echoed in Elena's mind. The Holloways hadn't been stolen away in some dramatic snatch and grab. They had been erased in plain sight by someone who blended into the background with the authority of a uniform. Later, Elena sat in her office staring at the SUV photos again. She noticed something she hadn't before. On the driver's side floor mat, faint streaks of what looked like gray dust. She called the lab. They confirmed. Concrete dust mixed with traces of industrial sealant, not from a motel, from a worksite. Her pulse quickened. Whoever drove the SUV after the Holloways vanished had come from a place where concrete dust clung to boots and uniforms. A job site, a warehouse, maybe even one of Red Star's contracts. That night, unable to sleep, Elena drove past the old Red Star warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was boarded up with graffiti scrawled across the walls, weeds pushing through the concrete lot. She parked across the street, watching the building loom against the moonlight. It was silent now, but she imagined it in 1999. Trucks pulling in, men in blue coveralls unloading cargo, and workers moving unnoticed through the night. The warehouse was more than abandoned. It was a stage that had gone dark after the play ended. But the echoes still clung to the walls, waiting for someone to listen. When she returned to the station, her inbox held an email from the forensics team. Attached were magnified photographs of the SUV's interior. One showed a partial fingerprint smudged on the rearview mirror, degraded but legible enough for analysis. The lab had run it through databases. The result came back with a name. Elena stared at the screen, her heart pounding. The print didn't belong to any member of the Holloway family. It belonged to a former Red Star employee, one who had been on shift the very week the Holloways vanished. And suddenly, the SUV's reappearance felt deliberate. Not an accident of drought, a message. A reminder that whoever had moved the Holloways wanted their name whispered again, decades later. The lab's report lay heavy in Elena's hands. The partial fingerprint pulled from the SUV's rearview mirror matched one name from the old Red Star roster, a man listed as an equipment operator, terminated in late 1999. The file on him was thin, barely a page, just a note that he'd left without returning his uniforms or truck. No forwarding address, no trail. Elena requested old DMV records, tax filings, anything that might anchor him to a place. But he had dissolved like smoke. No property, no license renewals, no arrests. As if the year after the Holloways vanished, he'd stepped sideways out of existence. But the SUV, buried in a creek bed for 2 decades, only to surface when the drought lowered the waterline, carried his fingerprint. Not on a forgotten scrap of clothing, but on the rearview mirror, clear enough, distinct enough, to survive time. Elena replayed that thought as she sat in the empty squad room late at night. Prints degrade, especially after years of immersion and heat. For one to remain intact suggested it hadn't been left in 1999. It had been touched more recently. That meant someone had opened the SUV. Someone had returned to it. Someone had wanted the fingerprint to be found. The discovery was less evidence than performance. A curtain pulled back. A reminder whispered through the dust. The Holloways were not forgotten, and neither was the one who moved them. She pinned the fingerprint photo to her board, drawing a thick line between it and the SUV. Then she circled a question in red. Why now? The following morning, Elena returned to the creek bed where the SUV had been pulled out. She stood on the cracked soil, staring at the waterline, now a jagged scar across the banks. The toe marks were still visible, cutting through mud. She imagined the SUV settling into place in 1999, hidden beneath the current, a grave disguised as a vehicle. And she imagined someone standing here years later, pulling it back into light. The county engineer confirmed her suspicion. That creek doesn't just dry on its own, he said, pointing at aerial survey photos. Water was diverted upstream months before the drought hit hardest. See that ridge? A makeshift dam. Temporary, but enough to lower levels down here. Whoever did it wanted this vehicle to show. Deliberate. Not a coincidence. Not weather. An orchestrated reveal. Back at the station, Elena traced the line again. Red Star employee. Fingerprint. Creek diversion. She called the sheriff in charge back in 1999, who is now retired. His voice crackled on the line, brittle with age. Sheriff, when the Holloways went missing, did anyone ever suggest inside help? Someone using a uniform, access to the motel? A pause, then a sigh. Detective, we had whispers. Workers seen around the lot. A maintenance truck in the early hours. But the company had contracts with half the county. We couldn't chase every shadow. And the truth is, the motel owner didn't want trouble. Said if we started pulling on that thread, guests would stop coming. We wrote it up as a runaway. Cleaner that way. Elena closed her eyes. Cleaner. A word that left ash in the mouth. That evening, she sat in her office, the light fading to gray. She pulled the Holloways photograph closer, the four of them smiling, unaware of the storm ahead, and she whispered it to herself. You didn't just vanish. Someone erased you. Her phone buzzed. A restricted number. She answered. A man's voice, low and steady. Detective Marquez, you've seen enough. Her grip tightened. Who is this? A pause, then the faintest rasp of breath. Some stories aren't yours to tell. The line went dead. Elena sat frozen, the words echoing in her mind. Some stories aren't yours to tell. It wasn't a warning. It was ownership. Whoever had orchestrated the Holloways' disappearance and the SUV's reemergence still believed they controlled the narrative. She looked again at the fingerprint. A name tied to a vanished worker. A uniform. A truck. And now, a voice reminding her that silence was enforced, not accidental. For the first time, Elena felt not only that she was investigating the Holloways, but also that the Holloways' story was investigating her. The SUV was never just a discovery. It was a signal, and whoever sent it was watching. The board in Elena's office was crowded now, with photographs, maps, and red string pulling the Holloways toward Red Star, the SUV, and the single fingerprint that refused to disappear. But something gnawed at her, the company's reach. Red Star hadn't been tied only to the Willow Bend Motel. Their service contracts spread across dozens of motels and roadside stops in southern Texas during the late 90s. She filed a request for archived invoices, digging through microfilm reels at the county archives. Rows of names flickered under the machine's pale light. Budget inns, motor courts, isolated way stations, where travelers checked in and sometimes never checked out. One name caught her attention: Sunset Lodge, a rundown roadside stop 20 miles east. A contract dated 1998 for cleaning, repairs, and site management. That year, she cross-referenced with missing persons databases. A young couple, last seen checking into that very lodge. Their car was later found abandoned in a field, keys still in the ignition. Official cause: runaway. File closed. Elena leaned closer, tracing dates with her finger. Another contract. Desert Palms Motel, 1997. Same company. That year, a traveling salesman vanished after calling his wife from a payphone near the lobby. His briefcase was discovered later, in a ditch. Nobody. No arrest. She began circling names, contracts, and disappearances. What had once seemed like a family tragedy, the Holloways swallowed by bad luck or malice, was widening into something systemic. Families, couples, solitary travelers, different towns, same pattern, same company. That night, she visited the Sunset Lodge. The sign buzzed faintly, its letters half burnt out, casting the gravel lot in tired neon. Inside, The air smelled of mildew and stale smoke. The clerk behind the desk, an older woman with tired eyes, barely looked up. "Did Red Star ever work here?" Elena asked casually. The woman frowned. "Back in the day, yeah. Men in coveralls, blue ones, came around every few weeks. Cleaned drains, patched pipes, hauled junk. Didn't talk much. Management liked them. Said they were cheap and reliable." Elena nodded slowly, her stomach tight. Cheap, reliable, invisible. She walked the halls of the lodge, peeling paint flaking under her fingertips. She stopped outside room 12, the room the missing couple had rented in 1998. The door was dented, the lock rusted. She closed her eyes, listening to the hum of the neon, imagining footsteps in the night and uniforms passing by, unnoticed. Back at the station, she compiled the cases into a single timeline. Between 1996 and 2001, at least 6 disappearances were traced back to properties serviced by Red Star. The Holloways was only the most complete performance, the family tableau staged in an SUV. The others were fragments, rough drafts of the same play. Elena leaned back in her chair, heart pounding. Red Star wasn't a maintenance company. It was a mask. A structure that allowed men to move through spaces unseen, collect lives, erase them, and walk away with uniforms still clean. The next morning, she visited the state labor office, requesting Red Star's employment files. The clerk returned with a box thick with applications, ID photos, and payroll slips. Elena sifted through them one by one. Most were drifters, men who worked for a season and moved on. But some names repeated, appearing across different sites and different years. And one photograph, stapled to a half-completed application, stopped her cold. A man in his 20s, square jaw, and dark eyes that seemed to look straight through the lens. No signature, no address, just temporary hire, scrawled across the top. The same name as the fingerprint on the Holloways SUV. She carried the photo back to her office, staring at it under the desk lamp. The face seemed to belong everywhere and nowhere, like a shadow that had been caught by accident. She pinned it to the center of her board, a focal point pulling every string taut. That night, rain hammered against the station windows. Elena sat alone, the photograph staring back at her. She whispered aloud, "It wasn't random. None of it." The phone rang. Another restricted number. She hesitated, then answered, the same low voice. "Detective, you've drawn your map. You see the pattern now. But the story ends where it began. Back at the motel, back at the room. Don't come looking. Leave the ashes where they fell." The line cut. Elena sat frozen, the echo of the words vibrating in the silence. The ashes where they fell. She looked at the photograph again, at the motel contracts, and at the Holloways smiling in the family portrait. The SUV hadn't been a grave. It had been a marker, a way of saying, "Look here." But the voice on the phone made it clear. Whoever had staged that marker wasn't finished writing. And now, she was no longer just investigating the Holloways. She was standing inside a script someone else had authored, and the next act was already waiting. The rain had softened to a persistent mist that made every lamp halo bleed into the night. Elena sat in her car outside the shuttered motel, the photograph of the temporary hire, tucked under the visor like a confession she couldn't fold away. The image was a small, impersonal thing, with grainy, washed-out edges, yet it had the peculiar force of a relic. You could see how the eyes were empty, not of feeling, but of intent. She thought of that fingerprint on the SUV, the contracts, the motel room door ajar, and the voice on the phone telling her to leave the ashes where they fell. Whoever had written this pattern did not want it unraveled. Whoever had written it had been careful. Inside the motel, light flickered through the curtains of room 7. A television murmured on a static channel, and the air smelled of bleach and old coffee. Elena moved slowly, a practiced shadow. Her boots made no sound that mattered. She had a warrant tucked in the inner pocket of her coat like another good decision. She had patience like a small weapon. The manager was an old man with years stacked into his face. He answered the door with a businesslike sadness and a cigarette trembling between his fingers. Elena flashed the paper. "We're going to take a look through your maintenance logs, your vendor list, everything tied to Red Star." His laugh was thin. Red Star? They were ghosts. Came in the night. Left before breakfast. Paid in cash sometimes. Managers loved it. No complaints. No paperwork problems. He shrugged, as if the shrug could erase the things it touched. They led her to a back office where a metal filing cabinet leaned, one drawer stubborn with rust. The manager handed her a single ledger. The ink faded, but legible in places. Names, dates, checkboxes. Red Star was scrawled into the margins like a cough. She traced the columns with gloved fingers. There, a notation. Room 12 cleaning, at 2 a.m. sealed. Elena's jaw tightened. She asked about cameras. There were no cameras, he said. The owner had been cheap. Besides, who would want to look at footage from a place where drunks checked in and truckers slept? Who indeed? She forced the ledger open wider, sliding phone photos into evidence. The pattern sharpened. Red Star's initials stamped into invoices. The same sequence of visits a week before each disappearance. The motel manager swallowed hard. A small animal caught in a glare. He handed her a shift list. Names blurred, scribbled in the margin. One line, repeated across months, matched the signature from the temporary hires application. Same scrawl, same careless undercut. The man was not a ghost. He had a trail. Back at the station, Elena played the trail like a needle across vinyl. Every pin on the county map had a date. Every date had a motel, a roadside, a family. She dragged the red string from the Holloways to Sunset Lodge, to Desert Palms, to that salvage yard with its graveyard scent. The string hummed with implication. For days she moved through rooms and records, a nurse tending an infection. She interviewed clerks and dishwashers, men who had washed the same hired coveralls, and women who worked night shifts, and who remembered seeing the uniformed crew hauling heavy bags. Each memory was a small, dull stone that added weight to the whole. "Did anyone ever ask questions?" she asked once, reading from a report in the dim light of a diner before dawn. A busboy named Marcos shrugged, fingers moving through a towel. "Questions come with ears. Ears that ask get shut. Folks don't like to poke at what keeps them paid." The practical answer turned moral. Red Star provided cover for cheap labor, an unremarkable badge of service that let men move through liminal spaces unobserved. Liminal. Thresholds where the world is neither home nor highway. Motels are thin places. People arrive and disappear in the middle of nights. Red Star had learned to move there like the tide. It surprised Elena how often bureaucracy became inequality's shadow. The motel managers were small men balancing ledgers. County inspectors filed their rounds and waved signatures through. A contract was a contract. A contract meant invoices, and invoices meant someone else signed. Papers had names. Names led to companies. Companies led to bank records. The deeper she dug, the more she realized the system was not only built by the men in coveralls, it was enabled by a pattern of willful blindness and convenience. On the third week, a call. A voice that had been careful until now, cracked with urgency. "You're pushing on the rusted part. Careful. No number. No trace." A warning or a courtesy. Elena couldn't tell which. She kept pushing. Labor office disclosures, payroll, off-the-books transactions, small checks that together constructed a ledger of complicity. Men who should have been red flags had been green-lighted by signatures in margins no one later wanted to recall. Then, a breakthrough. A bank receipt that didn't belong. Buried inside a laundromat's deposit, there was an unremarkable cash deposit made in a sequence that matched when Red Star was paid. The depositor, a holding company with a dull name. The owner was a trustee who had once donated to local campaigns. Elena felt the room tilt when she realized how close this ledger brought her to people whose faces were in town, posters and ribbon cuttings. She thought of the Holloways photograph, of family smiles caught in a private moment and made public by the absence of the camera now enforced. She thought of the little boy with his rabbit, and of the suitcase left like a stage prop. The system had flattened lives into transactions, then recycled the transactions into deniability. One night, she met an unnamed witness behind a hardware store, beneath a street lamp that buzzed like an insect throat. He wore a thrift store coat too heavy for the season. He had worked for Red Star once and carried the look of a man who had seen the bottom of a pan. "It wasn't always like that," he said, voice parchment. "At first it was hauling, cleaning, and hauling again. But then someone in charge started asking for things. Logistics. Timetables. You bring the people here at this hour. No noise. Keep the receipts. No pictures." There was a man that gave orders. He didn't show his face, just a card with a name and signatures. I refused. They made it clear to refuse, and someone finds out where your kids go to soccer practice. "Did you see anyone taken?" Elena asked. "No, but I saw the vans come in. I saw the bags. The men that got out never came back cheerful. They were quiet. Me, I left. Best thing I've done. But I kept a scrap." He handed her a photocopy, a snippet of a manifest. A single line read, "Room 12 sealed Red Star. Date, time." Elena thanked him and tucked the photocopy into her pocket like a talisman. The manifest was not proof by itself, but layered with the fingerprint, with the bank slip, with the motel contracts, and with the ledger. A pattern was becoming a machine. She thought of the voice on the phone. "Don't come looking for any of the threats etched in the ghost motel's neon." The machine had teeth. It had friends in places that kept doors open. She could see, suddenly, how those friends had smoothed the way. Closed files, reclassified runaway reports, and a missing child's report lost in an overworked clerk's basket. It was one thing to find a monster in a yard. It was another to identify the men who polished the boots. Elena knew the map of men in power well enough to know the names would not fall without a fight. She assembled the team quietly. One trusted forensic analyst, one field officer whose loyalty was inventory and habit, and one legal counselor who would not be easily compromised. They would move methodically, chain of custody sharpened like a blade. No leaks, no press, precision. This was not a spectacle, but even as they plotted, the phone calls became more frequent. The warnings are less veiled. A delivery left at her door. An ash-soiled postcard, nothing more than 3 words. "Leave it buried." Elena taped the card to the board beneath the photograph of the man in the application, beneath the fingerprint image. She looked at the photos, at the ledger entries, and at the motel room doors that opened onto nothing. She felt the gravity of the decision she was about to make, the choice to excavate or to turn away. There would be consequences. There would be risk. She chose to excavate. They moved at dawn, a small unit with boots in the mud and cameras in hand. Their first stop was a storage locker tied to the holding company's trustee. No one watched. The lock cracked like a wish. Inside lay a pallet of sealed boxes. Labels read, "Linen, spare parts, misc." Beneath the innocuous inventory, they found a nested set of boxes that had been carefully wrapped, evidence that someone had thought long about how to keep things out of sight. Taped to the inside lid of the topmost box was a photograph. A family seated on an SUV's tailgate, smiling for no one. It was the same family Elena had seen before, and in their hands was a small object, an item that had once been a child's, now quiet as a tombstone. A whisper moved through the team. The boxes contained photographs, video reels, and document archives of the erased. Files with dates, leads that smelled of oil and bleach. Someone had curated a museum of what they'd taken. Elena's breath left her chest slow and heavy. The machine was not only harvesting people, it kept souvenirs, a collection, trophy cases. The phone in her coat vibrated with a new message. One line, "We saw what you did." She looked at the photograph again, at the manifest, and at the blue ink ledger that had once been a manager's casual record. The map had a new node, the storage locker. But the machine had teeth. The next move was theirs. Elena felt the calm she had cultivated like armor. She pressed her palm to the ledger and whispered, as if to the family on the SUV's tailgate, "I'm coming." Then she stood and lit a cigarette she would not inhale, the smoke a poor replica of resolve. Outside, the dawn had begun to silver the mist. She stepped into it, steps measured, a woman walking into a conversation that would not end politely. The last act of this story does not arrive with a tidy confession or a headline that makes everything clean. It arrives in quieter increments, in the slow arithmetic of papers signed and shoes tied, in the small procedural movements that look like chores but function as justice's scaffolding. In the months that followed the discovery in the SUV, the work unfolded along two parallel planes: the visible, procedural cascade of lab reports, subpoenas, and courtroom motions, and the private, relentless labor of translating fragments into meaning for a family left suspended for decades. The car's interior had told a simple, terrible tale. Folded clothes pressed into baskets of dust, a receipt slipped into a visor, and a child's sock lodged beneath a seat. And from those small, stubborn facts, an argument could be constructed. Forensics could say where a fabric had been handled. Chronologies could be tightened by timestamps and utility logs, and archival searches could find the motel ledger, whose ink had gone faint, but not entirely blind to the passing of that night. Still, each technical victory arrived with a price. The retelling of what was lost, the return of grief to a household that had learned a kind of coping that resembled removal. Family members pressed for names. They wanted to point at a face and add it to their vocabulary of wrongs. The investigators provided as much evidence as could be firmly supported, and where doubt remained, they said so plainly. The language of the case moved between the clinical and the tender. In depositions and in private conversations, the phrase, "we cannot yet prove," became a strict, almost ethical punctuation. It protected the living from the arrogance of premature certainty, even as it frustrated the living, who wanted the solace of answers. Trials, when they occurred, were uneven. Some defendants pleaded to avoid the uncertainty of a jury. Others beat charges on technical grounds, where decades had thinned the thread of admissible proof. A few men received sentences that matched some ledger of culpability, but those outcomes never matched the scale of absence. The law could punish a body, but it could only gesture toward the repair of what had been taken. The birthday candles unblown, the homework folded into a drawer that would never be opened in the same hand again. In the public square, the story made a modest re-entrance. Documentaries and insistently paced news segments recounted the sequence that led from an abandoned motel room to a cleaned SUV in a strip lot, and they did so with the sober cadence that the discovery demanded. Policy memos were drafted in the wake of revealed lapses. Logbooks were mandated to be retained in digitized form. Evidence rooms were audited, and emergency lines for anonymous tips were amplified. These changes were the sort of institutional remedies that can be cataloged in a list and folded into a report. They mattered procedurally and ethically, but they did not stitch the family back together. The survivors found different forms of reparation. An elderly relative who had lived in a quiet house 2 blocks from the motel began, slowly, to speak in public for the first time, offering testimony that filled in a gap in the timeline. A neighbor's journal from that summer, scribbled with details about license plates and a series of nights when headlights slid past on an empty street, was unexpectedly found in a box in an attic and turned in. Its tiny notations supplied a rhythm missing from other records. A cassette, which had been misfiled and nearly thrown out, was digitized and cleaned to reveal a voice so faint it was almost a presence rather than a sound. A child asking simply a question about where they were going. Those small recoveries did not equal full closure, But they altered the family's relationship to the unknown. They allowed certain assumptions to be retired, and new facts to be placed beside grief like weathered markers. The memorial work became as important as the procedural. A stone was chosen, and words were agreed upon with painstaking care. No flourish, only the family surname, and a line about remembrance. On the day the stone was set, people moved through weather that threatened rain, and offered objects that spoke far less than tears. A postcard, a toy with its stuffing long since thinned, and a handwritten note folded many times. The community's ritual was not an exorcism, but a practice of witness. It was here, in these small public acts, that the moral kernel of the investigation found its home. The insistence that someone keep seeing, keep naming, and keep refusing to make a life into a rumor. Months wound into years. The cases that had been wrenched into public view settled into the slow tedium of appeal and administrative review. Some perpetrators disappeared from the landscape of culpability dead, relocated, or hidden by time. Others remained litigable figures moving through courtrooms and custody battles. The most difficult reckonings were not legal at all. They were reckonings of conscience within institutions that had once tolerated sloppiness, or worse, complicity. A handful of internal reviews produced apologies that read mechanically because the machinery of redress is rarely suffused with the language of sorrow. Still, some committed themselves to different work. A small task force codified a new practice for handling motel logs and impounded vehicles. An evidence officer, who had long maintained a quiet integrity, taught a clinic on how to keep the chain of custody intact when decades complicate memory. Those changes were incremental, but they mattered because they lowered the chance that another case would be lost to avoidable error. The family whose surname the community had learned to write with a peculiar tenderness lived in a twilight between the world before and the world after. There were days of ordinary smallness, a birthday cake with candles steadied by caregiver hands, a backyard with wind chimes clicking like patient metronomes. And there were days of impossible remembering, anniversaries where silence pooled like cold water, the seasons turning with an indifferent punctuality that seemed at once cruel and consoling. Their presence at hearings became a kind of liturgy, testimony offered not for the sake of vengeance, but as a mapping of what human lives had been shortened. The youngest among them, who had once been a small shape in a photograph found in the SUV, grew into adulthood with a particular inventory, the knowledge of places they had never been, and the memory of garments discovered in a car whose seams remembered other hands. That knowledge made them both fragile and stubborn. They demanded that records remain open, that small clerical victories be broadcast to the communities they had once been part of. Years later, a prosecutor would say in a press conference that the case had taught the county how to listen to small artifacts again. The receipt, the cassette, the child's shoe, and that those artifacts had become in the public imagination talismans against forgetting. The family, however, never allowed public language to co-opt the interior quality of their loss. They accepted the stone, the legal determinations, and the policy changes, but they also guarded, fiercely, the private rituals that would never be televised. A chair left empty at holiday tables, a folded napkin preserved in a drawer, a photograph taken out and held until the edges softened in the hands that remembered. The investigator who had led the renewed inquiry retired to a quieter life, but not to silence. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit in her car outside the motel and let the neon's hum reach her like a slow metronome. She kept a slim folder of copies, a motel register, a lab report, and a photograph of the SUV when it had been impounded. These documents were not trophies. They were tools, reminders of what had been found and what still might be found. She taught young officers how to care for evidence, how to listen for patterns that don't at first look like patterns, and how to hold uncertainty as an ethical posture rather than a liability. Her most durable instruction was simple. Treat things as if they matter, because sometimes the world only releases its secrets to those who behave as if it might. In the end, the story's close was less an ending than a stabilization. Some names were forever tethered to the indictment lists and court dockets. Others dissolved into the procedural fog. What remained, insistently, was the family's surname carved into stone on a bluff, the SUV's cleaned interior photographed in an evidence locker, and the misfiled cassette finally placed in a digital archive. Together, those artifacts formed a register against erasure. The narrative refused a final cinematic resolution. It refused the consolations of a tidy moral. Instead, it offered a steadier, less glamorous promise that people kept watching, kept asking, and kept bringing fragments to light. That promise of continued attention, of the small, stubborn work of testimony and filing and memorializing, was perhaps the only real answer the family would ever need. It did not repair everything, but it kept memory live enough to matter. If you found yourself immersed in this story and want to hear more haunting accounts where mystery and human choices collide, make sure to subscribe. Your support allows these stories to keep being told, so the names of the lost are never swallowed by silence again.